What I just said now, this is not to be found in anything I have written. This video becomes an important one because it has no other sources. That this was not talked about anywhere else, at least not in the complete way we just did now.
We'll dive into some questions now. These questions all in some way relate to the dissociation or alter. Yeah, some people have asked what you mean by dissociation in this context.
So dissociation is when certain cognitive bridges are not present. They may have been present and then they are no longer present, or they may have never been there. A cognitive bridge is what allows you to go from one mental content to another because of a certain association. For instance, if you think of inflatable, colorful balloons, you think of a birthday party. That's a cognitive bridge. That's an association between two completely different experiential states. One perceiving or imagining colorful air balloons, and the other one, everything related to a birthday party. Now, that birthday party, in turn, can lead to an association with parents, your mother, your father, childhood. So these are cognitive associations. They are the glue of mind. They are the glue that keeps a mental space sort of integrated and gives us a sense of a unified self. We are not just disjoint little experiential states here and there, like a memory here, a self-image there. No, we are sort of a coherent, integrated web of mental states that are mutually associated. You can imagine that in the form of a graph, as in graph theory, where you have the vertices and the connections between the vertices. A dissociation is when those connections are not there. When they may have been there, but they are no longer there. For instance, if you can't remember something, you know that you know, then you're momentarily dissociated from one of your mental contents. You can't get to it. And later on, you remember it. So you know it was there all along. You just couldn't get to it. You didn't find an associative path to go from your present experience to remembering that state. When you are dreaming at night, you are dissociated from yourself because you identify with your dream avatar, but not with the mind that is creating all the rest of the dream, buildings, trees, the other people. So you're dissociated from yourself because when you wake up, you know that it was you doing the whole dream. It was you imagining the whole thing. You are dissociated when you are having relationship problems at home, and then to perform at work, you park your relationship problems. You sort of find a little drawer to shove them in and keep them outside of your immediate awareness when you are at work so you can function. That's a self-induced form of dissociation. There are many, many different types of dissociation based on clinical experience. There is, for instance, ownership dissociation, which has nothing to do with remembering or forgetting. Ownership dissociation happens when some people, for instance, have a traffic accident and they suffer head trauma, and they still remember all their memories. They didn't forget it. It's not that kind of dissociation, but they remember their memories as if they were from somebody else. They lose that sense of owning their memories as something that is theirs. And they contemplate this subjectivity that was behind all of those memories as a stranger, as if they had inherited the memories of somebody else, of another life. Dissociation can also be not symmetric. For instance, you can have people with dissociative identity disorder, which is the most extreme form of dissociation. And usually, different alters, different dissociated centers of awareness in a person suffering from DID, they cannot access each other's mental contents, personality states, memories, narratives, and so forth. But sometimes, and there is a record of this in the clinical literature, for instance, alters A and B. B knows nothing about A, but A has direct access to the inner life of B. It's asymmetric. One has access to the other, but not the other way around. And that access to the inner life of B has a ownership dissociation. Even though B can experience A from A's own first person perspective, B doesn't feel that A is him or her. B experiences that perspective as a perspective of someone else. You can do a thought experiment to understand this. Imagine that you're fitted with a virtual reality headset, and the cameras and microphone that feed your headset are connected to somebody else as somebody else goes about life. So you see what that person sees, you hear what that person hears, but you know it's not you. Or you can even, stretch this further and you think, what if medicine or technology could not only allow you to see the world or perceive the world from another person's perspective, but allow you access to all of that person's memories? You would still know that you are you and you're not that, but you are experiencing the other person's memories from a first person perspective, and the other person's perceptions from a first person perspective. Yet you still know you're you and not the other person, because you know that stuff is strange. It's not yours. But if you then take a step further and you say, and now after having access to somebody else's memories, to somebody else's personality dispositions, and to somebody else's perceptions, now you forget your own. Now you think you really are the other person, even though it's still your subjectivity all along. That's dissociation. The dissociation is what makes you think that you own or identify with a certain set of mental states, and that set of mental states limits your identity. So in this thought experiment, you would become dissociated from yourself the moment you think you're really somebody else, even though there has been no discontinuity in time of your subjectivity. Your subjectivity has remained intact. The experiencer has always been the same. But first you were person A, and now you think you're person B, because dissociation, forgetfulness, or the ability to experience something from a first person perspective. So it's a small word, dissociation, but it hides an entire world of phenomenology. But essentially, that's what it is. It's becoming disconnected from a broader space of mental content, restricted to a subset of that, and then believing that that subset is what defines you, forgetting that what you really are is the subjectivity that experiences the whole thing as subset, or the whole thing doesn't matter. The subjectivity is the same, it's continuous, has never been broken, but we forget that, and that's what leads to individual identity, the narrative self, and the shit show of life because of that.
Karine, you had a question about the role of language?
Hi, Amir. Hi, Bernardo.
Hi, Karine.
Yes, I'm very interested in the relationship and the continuities and differences between humans and other animals. So I was wondering, the process of dissociation, for humans that leads to a form of metaconsciousness, whereas animals presumably only have phenomenal consciousness. But are there degrees of dissociation, for instance, in various species? And what is, for humans, the role of language in dissociation? I've been reading Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, and he has his latest book is The Language Animal. He says humans are not only animals with language, but humans are linguistic beings. We are existing in the linguistic domain, in the linguistic dimension, and language is one of the things which separates us from the rest of the world. What is your view on that, Bernardo?
I think that it would be amazing if there aren't degrees of metacognition in nature. It would be like if it's a binary function that's switched on us and switched off everywhere else. I mean, one would need to give a very solid explanation for that, because that's not what you would expect. You would expect a sort of analog or continuous development of higher level mental functions. So I think pachyderms probably have some degree of metacognition. They mourn their dead. This requires a degree of metacognition. Corvidians do the same. They mourn their dead. There is some evidence for rituals even amongst Corvidians. It's not clear. It's very polemical, but no, at least there is a discussion around it. You
Yeah,
can
they also seem to recognize human faces. I've
oh,
read.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't need metacognition for that. It's pattern recognition. So it's not necessarily a higher level mental function. What relates to metacognition here is that to recognize different faces requires attunement and attention. It's very important for us humans to recognize the faces of other individuals in our group and also recognize emotions in their faces, because it's part of the social glue that keeps us together. But if you go to Asia, an Asian will say, well, you guys, you Europeans, you all look the same. And we tend to think the same about them. Like the Asians sort of look the same. It's because that fine tuning of our ability to recognize things, to do pattern recognition, evolved in a social context. And you could imagine that there is a relationship with metacognition there, because it requires to see a self in another. It requires that understanding that behind the facial expressions of someone else, there is a conscious entity like we are. So for social interaction, this is to some degree relevant. Now, regarding the other part of the question, language. Language, as we understand language, in other words, symbolic processing, not only signs. Other animals have signs.
Yes.
But symbolic processing requires that you replace contents of empirical reality with concepts in your own mind. And then you use the concepts. And only after you process the concepts, you translate it back to empirical reality. This ability cannot arise without metacognition, because it depends on the recognition of the personal self as an agent within an external world. If you think you are the whole thing, you can't do this symbolic processing. You can't do this replacement of contents of the world contents of the world, replacing them with concepts. It requires that you recognize yourself as a conscious agent operating within a larger context that is not yourself, and therefore being inclined to model this outside context in your own mind. This is what language allows us to do through inner chatter, inner conversations. We model the external world in the internal world through ideas that exist in our minds, but supposedly correspond to contents of the world outside. Without some form of metacognition, there is no outside. There is perception, but there isn't a recognition of an outside world that needs to be modeled. And finally, the third aspect of it, so what does that mean? Yes, language requires some degree of metacognition at least, but we do have metacognition, we do have language, so what does it mean? It means that we are uniquely able to live in our own reality. Not because we don't share a world, obviously we do, but because we tend to experience that shared world by proxy. What we experience is our own narrative about the world, is our own linguistic architecture that is supposed to capture the world, but it doesn't do that accurately. I would say never 100% accurately, and often exceedingly inaccurately. So if you, for instance, if you have a complex of inferiority, the world in which you will live in is a world in which people's facial expressions, gestures, and even body language are all suggesting that they think of themselves as superior to you. While somebody else with a different complex, we all have complexes, somebody else with a different complex will experience those same facial expressions, words, gestures, body language in a completely different way. And both will think that it's really reality that they are experiencing. It's really objective. It's out there. It's not their own story making. And for us, this means that we have unique capacities. For instance, we can really model the world. We can predict what nature is going to do next. This is linguistic outcome, not in linguistic in the sense of the operational way in which we exchange words, but linguistic in the way of symbolic reasoning, replacing contents of the world through concepts, and then operating on those concepts. That's what we call science. That's what we call philosophy. We are not operating in the world or on the world. We are operating on our own concepts, and we trust that there is a sort of straightforward translation between the world and our concepts, back and forth. So our conceptual webs sort of reflect something relevant about reality. That's the hope. And insofar as this is true, we have unique capacities. We have science. We can predict stuff. We can come up with theories. We can come up with accounts for events. We can explain the past, anticipate the future. We can coordinate our ability to work together among strangers. We just have to share some conceptual fictions. Like money has value, even though you can't eat it. If you burn it, it hardly produces heat. But we share the fiction that a piece of paper has value. And that allows us to coordinate work across 8 billion people on a small rock. It's amazing stuff.
Sorry,
okay,
that was a mistake.
Sorry. But insofar as our conceptual world, our linguistic world, does not reflect reality, and both are true. To some extent, it does reflect reality. That's a strength. To some extent, it does not, and that's a liability. That is behind, for instance, fascism. It is a narrative about what's going on that justify barbaric acts. Self-torture. I'm pretty good at self-torture. I was given very high ability by the maker to torture myself, like Nietzsche. Nietzsche had the same. I keep on reminding myself Nietzsche was the same, so I can bear it a little bit more, so I can live with it better. But I can torture myself, and all the way into the end of times. If I don't police myself, I can torture myself.
I go, yeah.
Yeah, and that is the liability of living in a conceptual world, a linguistic world, as opposed to the world as it actually is, at least as it actually is perceived. Because the world as perceived, ideally, has no interpretation. But we are incapable of that. Actually, this is theoretically shown to be so by integrated information theory. For us, perception is already an interpretation. You don't have a network of perceptual states on the one hand, and then you overlay a network of interpretational states on the other. No, they are merged together. And because of the unification principle of IIT, you cannot discern them. We do not have the ability to discern between pure perception and interpretation. Even though we know that they are two separate things, we do not have the ability to experience them as such. So yeah, in conclusion, linguistic reasoning in the context of metacognition is nature's greatest gamble. Because on the one hand, it allows for nature to conceptualize itself and therefore to, in a way, step out of itself and contemplate its own unfolding, as opposed to being blind by the instinctive flow of its own mental content. In other words, a form of unconsciousness. There is experiential states, but there is no overview. There's no stepping back to contemplate what it is. Through us and our linguistic thinking, nature has achieved that. Nature can sort of step out of itself and contemplate itself objectively. But the same linguistic reasoning has created thermonuclear warfare, fascism, barbaric geopolitics, in which fictions of nation states replace the lived reality of human suffering, the climate crisis, racism. I mean, the list is endless. So it is a big gamble on the part of nature. We can pretty much end the life on this planet as we know it. very quickly and very easily. And in a sense, it's amazing it hasn't happened yet. But without this gamble, nature can't step out of itself and know itself from a different perspective. So fingers crossed, that's my philosophy. Fingers crossed, no regret. Whatever is happening is what nature chose to do. What we do have to maintain is moral clarity. We should not take certain things for granted just because they are happening all the time. Like give you an example. We think of the Holocaust, 6 billion Jews. And I don't want to minimize that. That was absolutely horrendous. And I'm not minimizing that in any sense. But if you understand that it's the same core subjectivity behind the eyes of every pig, of every chicken, of every cow, then there are multiple Holocausts happening every single day, completely according to the law. And nobody raises an eyebrow about that. There are more pigs in my country than human beings. Yes, and they are all suffering immensely. They don't have space to turn their butts around. They never see the sun or step on grass. And they live for 6 months. And when they are lucky, because when you are unlucky and you're a female, you're kept pregnant all the time. I mean, and you're castrated without anesthesia if you're a male, or if you're a male chick, you're thrown alive into a meat mincer. Literally, you're thrown into the mincer, and there are millions being thrown into the mincer every day as soon as they hatch from their eggs. I mean, I'm not minimizing any of this. We have to maintain moral clarity about what's happening. But it's nature's gamble. So from that perspective, to roll up in a fetal position in a corner, disgusted by what the world is, in a sense, it's like being arrogant because, nature's doing this. So, let's go and see what happens and then do the best we can. That would be my approach to it.
Yeah. And language has also given us a lot of beauty, like Shakespeare and poetry and all those things. Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernardo.
Cheers.
Well, I was going to ask Bernardo, sure you're familiar with this predictive processing model of perception, in which even just visual data or what we're hearing or our body sensations are also, to use the controversial word, hallucinated, or they're more top down than they are bottom up. I imagine animals, for the most part, probably have a similar process.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
they're also in a map or a model. It's just not a metacognitive one.
Yeah, but it does not require conceptual reasoning. That's a lower level thing associated with perception, like the illusion of the convex or the concave face, or the ballerina that is rotating left or right. And the image is the same, but people see it in completely different ways. Would animals have that? Surely. They also have to restrict their inner entropy. They also have to have inferential states, because it's impossible to mirror the states of the world completely. So all of this plays a role, but we have all that, plus the layers of conceptual interpretation, model making, narrative making. I don't think animals have that. I don't think, for instance, my cats have that. They, for instance, the leader of my pack here, Floki, which is the one that crashes my interviews now and then, he can be angry. He can be upset. He can feel disrespected. He felt it the other day because he reverted to sort of scratching his claws on my living room rug again, as opposed to his pole, scratching pole. And I was telling him, Floki, stop it. And he continued. Then I went to him and I pushed him out of the rug. And if you ever heard an old man complaining and, why is this? Why are you doing that? Oh, that was that cat. He meowed like that for 15 seconds. Like, yeah, now get, if I could put words, it's like, oh, come on, stop this. Let me do the thing. What an annoying thing, he's stopping me from doing that. You could almost hear him say that, verbally almost. But he would not hold a grudge. Half an hour later, he'll come to my lap and rub cheeks with me, and everything is fine again. In other words, he did not create a narrative in his head about Bernardo disrespecting him and him being inferior in the hierarchy and therefore holding a grudge. No, that didn't happen. So this is something we do. I don't think, at least cats, I don't think they do that. Now, I reserve judgment about pachyderms, elephants, because I don't have experience with them. I have been in the proximity of an elephant only a couple of times. It affected me a lot. There is somebody behind those eyes there, and somebody bigger than a cat. For most animals, I don't think they have this kind of inner narrative making that replaces even the delusional contents of perception.
Beautiful image. Annie, you have a question about, does experience presuppose dissociation?
Yeah, hi, Amir. Hi, Bernardo.
Hi.
Great to be with you.
Hi, Annie.
Hi. Yeah, my question is, does a specific form or quality in awareness presuppose a dissociative boundary? So does awareness taking on a particular form imply there must be another alter across that boundary? Or is it possible for experience to arise purely internally within a unified field of awareness without dissociation? Thank you.
I think it's clearly possible. I mean, it's possible even with us. If you're dreaming at night, and you're properly deep dreaming, so you don't have residual perceptions or subliminal perceptions, you're really immersed in your dream. Everything you're experiencing is endogenous. Your eyes are closed, your ears are turned off, your sense of touch is turned off. If you are in a perfect sensory deprivation chamber, and we are very close to that in practice, you're not seeing, you're not hearing, you're not feeling, you're not touching, you're not tasting, you're not smelling. But there are all kinds of endogenous mental states arising in your mind. Some types of mental states are fundamentally endogenous. For instance, thoughts are endogenous. You don't need to perceive to think. On the contrary, you think better if you're not perceiving. That's why we don't like the vacuum cleaner to be on when you're trying to think something through. Emotions are largely endogenous. They can be triggered by perception, but they do not require that to be the case. If you have a negative thought, I promise you, there will be a negative emotion arising purely from within that was not triggered by anything on the outside. So a great many types of experiential states do not require perception and therefore do not require dissociation. But perceptual states do require dissociation, because without a dissociation, every mental state is endogenous. There is no world outside to be perceived. There is only what arises within you. And those are the original mental states. Before life arose in the universe, all existence was endogenous mental states. If there were a dissociation, if there were a living being to observe them, they would have a perceptual representation. But they were in and of themselves endogenous mental states. For perception, you do need a dissociative boundary. And you are correct that dissociative boundary, strictly speaking, always creates two alters, because a boundary means that there are two sides to it. And either side has its own conscious first-person perspective. Therefore, when the first living organism arose in the universe, arose in nature, then there was that organism as one alter and the rest of the universe, in other words, mind at large, as the other alter. But relatively speaking, mind at large entails so much more mental content that it is in practice appropriate to say that only a living being is an alter. And mind at large is all that ginormous stuff that is left behind, left out of living beings by the dissociative boundary that characterizes life. But strictly speaking, mind at large too is an alter. It's a kind of super all-encompassing alter that surrounds all the other alters. But it is still technically an alter. And from its own perspective, although most of its inner life would be endogenous states like thoughts, emotions, it too would perceive the other alters, just like we perceive it as the inanimate universe. It's just that living beings are such a tiny, small thing in the universe that perceptual states, from the point of view of mind at large, would be a very tiny, minor little experience. But there would, strictly speaking, be perception, because every dissociative boundary implies impingement from either side. The impingement from mind at large to life is what we call traditional perception. But the inner dynamics of mental states in a living organism impinges the other way around as well. And that could be perceived by mind at large, just as we perceive mind at large as the rest of the universe. So yes, there is a symmetry to dissociation. Perception is conditioned on there being this dissociation, but there are many other types of mental states that are not perceptual, they are endogenous, and therefore do not require dissociation. And those were the states that were there, constituted reality before life ever arose.
I've been curious whether thoughts and emotions were across a dissociative boundary, an endogenous boundary. So like, I see that distinction that thoughts, emotions, inner mental states are not across perhaps a harder dissociative boundary or a wider dissociative boundary that contains the mental states that I might call Annie or that might be associated with Annie, but whether there could be like from are you familiar with IFS therapy, internal family systems?
Yeah.
We have different parts, like on the kind of less extreme end of DID. And I'd wondered if maybe our thoughts and our emotions are perceptions across endogenous dissociative boundaries. Because like that experience with meditation and kind of becoming more unified, becoming more whole, and the mind quieting, I wondered if that's kind of less inner dissociative boundaries as parts kind of come back to capital S self. And with the dreaming, I'd wondered whether, yes, it's endogenous, but it's an exploration into the subconscious. There's that inner dissociative boundary there, and whether perhaps even dreaming that, like I'm looking across a dissociative boundary at a part that's kind of playing the role of an inner mind at large to give a backdrop to my dream alter.
I mean, I normally try to simplify it to sort of get people to understand the generalities of the approach. But of course, you're correct. To begin with, and no process in nature is perfect, so dissociation cannot be perfect. In other words, there will still be commerce of endogenous mental states across the dissociative boundary. Why would it be foolproof and completely impermeable? It's unlikely. Nothing else in nature is like this. There are losses. When something burns, not everything that is combustible actually combusts. When it stops raining, the water doesn't dry from the ground immediately. Every barrier is porous to some extent, and we have every reason to imagine that the same goes for the dissociative boundary. And the degree of porosity may vary with the particular layer in the human psyche that we are talking about. So this brings more sophistication and nuance into the idea. It's not like we are hermetically sealed bubble. You can imagine more like an undersea mountain that pokes out of the surface in the form of an island. And if you're above water, all you see is an island, and it seems to be hermetically sealed. But if you follow the way it goes under the water, it may actually be connected to another island under the water. So it is conceivable and coherent to think that if we think of the human mind in layers, which clinical evidence overwhelmingly indicates that is the appropriate way of regarding the human mind, then there are layers of the human minds that are less dissociated and therefore are more acquiescent to commerce across a dissociative boundary. And you see that amongst people who are emotionally connected to one another, and the way intuitions can go across and emotions can go across. arguably, and I'm going to say something that I cannot really defend, but it's just an intuition. Arguably, social insects have a layer of their minds that is not very dissociated from the other members of their own colony. And that's why they can do engineering, agriculture, architecture, and all that stuff. Yeah, some biologists would say, no, it's all chemical signaling, perhaps. But at the level of what Jung called, for instance, Jung divided the mind, the psyche in 3 layers. The ego, the personal, so-called unconscious. It's not unconscious, it's just not metacognitive, not very associated. And then the collective unconscious. And that collective unconscious itself can have layers, like there is a human collective unconscious, but there's another layer in which all life on Earth is unified. And there's another layer in which maybe you go beyond the planet. So I think all of this is plausible, coherent, and there is clinical evidence that that's how it works. The ego is the most dissociated layer of the human psyche, but there are less dissociated layers in which there is some traffic across the boundary. You know, it's a porous membrane, and things may come in and out.
Thank you.
Thank you. You mean, Bernard, would come in and out between the individual alter and mind at large, or also within the kind of dissociated aspects of ourselves?
You mean communication?
No. So, like Annie was referring to, let's say, my personal dream being a perception of parts of what other people would call the subconscious. So it's dissociated from myself, much more. But I'm more associated with it than, let's say, you would be. Like, you probably wouldn't have dreams about my subconscious. I mean, you might. I don't know.
Dissociation is hierarchical. So there are definitely further levels of dissociation within this dissociated alter that we call ourselves. And there is every evolutionary impetus for this. Give you an example. Under analytic idealism, your entire body is what mental states look like. There is nothing in you corresponding to your body that is not mental. But you cannot access whatever mental state it is that looks like your liver or your kidney or your left big toe. You cannot introspect into the mental states that look like left big toes and livers and kidneys. That means that you're internally dissociated, and that's for extremely good reason. If you were not dissociated from the mental dynamics that constitute your autonomous functions, you would need to be deliberately and explicitly beating your heart every time, drawing every breath every time, processing blood in your kidneys every time, processing blood in your liver every time. You would have to attend to every aspect of your autonomous functions, which would be incredibly overwhelming cognitively and would prevent you from reacting to environmental challenges and opportunities. So of course we are internally dissociated. Functions that have to be performed all the time, like your heartbeat, your kidney function, your liver function, they are better off split off so they can do their own thing without requiring you, your ego, your metacognition to attend to that. And it's very easy to see that there are degrees of dissociation. For instance, when you learn to drive, you have to attend to every movement of your hands and your feet, every gear change you make. Couple of years later, it has sunk in, it has become autonomous. It has partly dissociated from the ego because there is an advantage to doing that. And your breath is a fantastic example because unlike heartbeat, most people can control, unlike heartbeat, we can take deliberate and explicit control of our breath. I can choose, I'll stop breathing for 30 seconds. My record is 4 minutes and 58 seconds, but I was very young when I did that, and I was into diving, you know, all that kind of stuff. So you can take for minutes long, explicit control over your breath. But you can also forget about breathing and you're still breathing. So breath is an autonomous function that can move across a dissociative boundary, can become dissociated, but you can bring it back in. Heartbeat, you can't. Yeah, except some people, I believe there are some meditators who have achieved control over their heart functions. I see no a priori reason why that shouldn't be possible. It may be very difficult, but why shouldn't it be possible? So we are almost by necessity, by evolutionary necessity, we are collectives. And if that happens when it comes to the mental processes that we call autonomous functions, why wouldn't it happen with some of the higher level dynamics of our minds? Why wouldn't we become dissociated from our emotions every now and then? I know for a fact that this happens, at least to me, because when you, let me be concrete, I can feel pain for days without knowing that I am in pain. Until something sort of triggers me and I realized, oh, I have been having this pain for a while now. Retroactively, I know that I was experiencing it. But if you had asked me a day before, are you in pain? I would say no, very sincerely. So we can, there is a constant dynamics of dissociation and reassociation of mental complexes within this outer that we are. In other words, there are layers of sub-outers, and those boundaries form and reform or dissipate or disappear, and it's a boiling collective of lower levels of dissociation in that hierarchy. What is defining, though, for living beings is that there is one level of that dissociation hierarchy that is very actively enforced. And that's something that IIT today does not capture. It's a discussion I've been having with Giulio for some time. IIT accounts for spontaneous dissociations and associations, because sometimes a certain complex can integrate more information if it sheds off parts of itself that are loosely integrated. You can show that in the mathematics, that if you shed off certain complexes, the reigning complex integrates more information, becomes more conscious. But of course, what you shed off doesn't stop being experienced. It just becomes dissociated from the highest phi complex, which is the ego, the reporting ego. So we are shedding off these dissociated outers all the time. Not only do we know that clinically, we know that theoretically. There is a theoretical mechanism, very well empirically substantiated, that shows that by necessity that happens. However, these spontaneous associations and dissociations are not actively enforced. They are spontaneous because they are given by the degree of information integration. But there is one layer that is not spontaneous. It's very actively enforced. And that layer is what looks like the outer surface of your skin. It's the layer that we call life. Life is actively enforced because for evolutionary reasons, that made sense. We don't want to die, right? If we die, nothing really is lost. It's just that there are some reassociations happening and some reintegrations happening. But from an evolutionary perspective, the mechanics of the process happened in such a way that the outers that actively resisted that reassociation are the ones that are still around. Because the ones who didn't produce descendants. They were reabsorbed before they had as many kids as the authors who happened to really actively enforce that boundary at that specific level of the hierarchy. This is not modeled under IIT. This active reinforcement of one particular level in the hierarchy is not modeled in IIT. I'm not going to speak for Giulio, but maybe one day he will come out and say, now I have a model for that too. Who knows? No, we have to wait and hear from him or not. Maybe he thinks it's not necessary. It's up to him. But under analytic idealism, what defines the outer we call life is not that it is the only level of dissociation. No, there are levels before it and after it. Before it, we don't know for sure, but there probably are. And after it, we know for sure from clinical studies and the theoretical, the theory of IIT. So it's not the uniqueness of a dissociation. There are many levels. It's just that the level we call life is very actively enforced. That dissociative boundary is very actively enforced. If we force an impingement across that boundary, if you pierce that boundary, then that's like being stabbed. That's what you're doing when you stab someone. You're forcibly piercing that actively enforced boundary. And it may recover itself, but it may not. It's like a whirlpool. Sometimes, circumstances as such, the whirlpool becomes so unbalanced that there is no saving anymore. It will dissipate. It does not have enough in it to sort of maintain this enforcement going, and then it just dissipates and gets reabsorbed. Now we call that death. So the special thing about life is that it's an actively enforced level of dissociation, not that it is the only level of dissociation.
And that's brilliant. And Annie, if it's okay, I'll riff off your question just because I have the same curiosity. It was, does experience presuppose dissociation? So if I'm imagining kind of mind at large before there's been any hard boundaries that we call life, and we've got this idea of endogenous experiences that don't form like a continually reinforced alter, do even those small semblances of excitation involve some level of very small hierarchical dissociation for there to be some kind of excitation?
It's possible.
Yeah.
So notice that now I'm using the word dissociation in two different senses: actively enforced dissociation and non-actively enforced dissociation, or spontaneous dissociation. The latter is modeled very nicely by IIT. But most of the time when you hear me talking about dissociation, what I mean by it is the actively reinforced one. So before life arose, there was no actively enforced dissociative process in the mind of nature, because what it looks like is what we call life. So before life, it wasn't there. But we have every reason to think that the mind at large has a spontaneous dynamics of dissociation and reassociation based on degrees of information integration. Julio calls it ontological dust, meaning that there may be many parallel, small, spontaneously dissociated processes going on in the mind of nature outside life. You can imagine it, you can try to think of it qualitatively as a form of fragmented feeling. So it's not DID. It's not like you have this internally coherent, strong alters. It's more like, as Julia says, ontological dust. It's this fragmented thinking and feeling. You can experience that in certain periods during a psychedelic trip. I don't know that from experience, but people who take Iboga report this kind of fragmented delirium-like experiencing. There is still only one core subjectivity, only one experiencer, but the contents of its experience are not neatly sort of linked together. They're sort of fragmented. So that's dissociation too. It's not actively enforced dissociation. It's not an alter in the way I mean it 95% of the times. But in the formalism of IIT, those are, there is a multitude of phi complexes out there in the inanimate world. They don't come together neatly in this unified ego that we have, and which looks like brain activity in a highly integrated brain. Mind at large, the way it looks like is the web of galaxies, and it does look like a brain, but relativistic limits are such that you don't have this signal integration. The universe is expanding too fast for this relatively small speed of light to form these reentrant loops of information integration in mind at large, at least insofar as we can derive it from its appearance, from the physical universe. So mind at large doesn't have an ego the way we do. It's unlikely to have that. To have a sort of a fragmentary experience of itself. It's only one experiencer, because there is only one experiencer. but it's a fragmentary experience. Then not the idea alters, because the idea alters are internally integrated. This would be more like ontological dust, a fragmentary experience of self.
Great. And just to link in, I think it's especially relevant to many meditators, but especially in the Buddhist tradition, I'm aware they consider thought to be another perception. Or I was rewatching a lecture by Anil Seth, and he was talking about your sense of self is another perception. It's constructed by the brain. It takes a whole bunch of like disparate data, and so yeah, that. So I wonder, Annie, if that was the same for you. Sometimes your distinction between exogenous and endogenous, because I've trained myself to think of it all as a perception, and I think some Advaita Vedanta does it as well. Of like, if you're perceiving it, it's not you. So it's continually looking at what isn't all the excitations, including thought and feeling.
Just before the question is asked, Amir, what I just said now, all these nuances about dissociative hierarchies, spontaneous dissociation, and actively enforced dissociation, this is not to be found in anything I have written. This is a subject for a book I haven't written yet, which is a kind of a dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It's sort of the closure of the theme of analytic idealism. So we are recording this, of course, as you normally do. But this video becomes an important one because it has no other sources. That this was not talked about anywhere else, at least not in the complete way we just did now.
Yeah. So you heard it here first, everyone. We now run a weekly membership program with Bernardo Kastrup that you can join at withrealityinmind.com. This includes weekly Q&As, special guests like Rupert Spira, Michael Levin, Federico Fagin. There's an international, vibrant community of researchers, academics, meditators, mystics, philosophers, poets, creatives, musicians, anyone that wants to deeply understand this philosophy and its potential implications for their lives. In this next clip, Bernardo explains his motivation for wanting to start this program, which include helping anyone that wants to deeply understand this, but also helping anyone that wants to become an ambassador for idealism.
For me, personally, helping create not only a community, I'm not trying to do activism here, I'm not trying to build an army of analytic idealists, but creating a community in which a deeper understanding of idealism in general, perhaps analytic idealism in particular, because that's what I can offer more, but a community around idealism that truly and deeply understands what it is, more than the average person who has heard about analytic idealism. I'm still getting today, after 15 years, mostly the same questions I used to get in year one. So progress in the world at large is very slow, but within a sort of a nurtured community, I think we can achieve a lot more, go a lot more in depth. And to use a word I used with Amir when we were discussing this, I don't know whether it's a goal or just a wish, so I'll keep it as a wish. I would like to help foment a community of ambassadors of idealism, people who will be equipped to go out into their communities, go into the world, and not preach analytic idealism, but when the subject comes up, they will be a sort of a source of light, an informed source of clarifications, of arguments, of reason, basically, a source of reason in their communities. And maybe that starts something that grows organically. By nature, I'm also a natural introvert, so playing a public role is fairly unnatural to me. It's something I can do because I learned, life forces you very early on to behave like an extrovert in science, in the corporate world, and especially when you're a book writer, you have to put your face out there and talk to people, confront the world. But by nature, I am an introvert, and so. And this may sound a little bit egocentric, maybe it is. It would be nice to have more voices out there, so I could feel more comfortable myself to allow myself to disappear in my Swiss Alps mountain every now and then, knowing that there is a whole group of people out there who are carrying the torch still. So yeah, those were my sincere motivations for this.